In this video, we're going to look at the president and the media. When it comes to managing the relationship with the media, the president has a few goals and tools that they can use to do that. Number one, they want to set the agenda. They want to try and influence what issues get covered at certain times in the year. For example, they might have a messaging calendar that will correspond with their different goals and targets for a legislative session. They might also want to shape the general narrative and tone of coverage that they receive from reporters and outlets. They can manage this relationship by offering certain reporters exclusive interviews in order to try and get their story out through the press. They can also use leaks strategically. So if you ever read reporting that suggests we received a copy from an administration official, that typically means that somebody in the president's staff or somewhere in the West Wing has given a reporter something off the record on the condition that they write about it favorably. So presidents and their administration will try and do that. They will also, at times, stonewall the press. They will try and present a united front and not let any information leak when there's perhaps a new policy being deliberated. At the press conference, when a president or the press secretary is answering questions, they will also try and spin. And what spin means is basically try to talk about something else that's more favorable. They might receive a question on a topic that they don't want to talk about, and so they will maybe try and just address that differently or frame it in a positive way that doesn't really answer the reporter's question. Most of this happens in the James Brady Press Room. Now, the White House Press Corps is the name given to the group of reporters that has a permanent residence at the office. And by residence, I just mean they have a desk and a permanent presence. Each news organization will have access to facilities so they can physically be at the White House essentially around the clock in case anything happens. There's a new crisis that develops and there's a need for the president or his staff to address the press. In a typical day, the press will meet in the office of the press secretary sometime in the morning for a gaggle. I mean, the gaggle is just a name for an informal meeting with the press to sketch out what the day will look like. The president's staff will describe where the president will be, if they're going to be meeting with anybody, and how many members of the press corps will be allowed. Sometimes there's something called the traveling pool, where instead of the entire press corps, which is dozens of different reporters and staff and photographers, they might just select 3 people to go to a given event and then report back to the rest. So there might be somebody representing the wires, somebody from TV, somebody from radio, and a photographer. And they would be the designated pool of people to cover that event and then report back to the rest of the press corps. After the morning gaggle, the next big highlight of the day is the daily press briefing. This typically happens in the briefing room with the press secretary. The press secretary will handle questions from the reporters. It is their chance to perform their watchdog function each day, to grill the administration, to try and get answers from them about what's going on in the world. Typically, the press secretary will not want to do that. They will try and, again, avoid the question and spin and emphasize the positives instead of any potential negative stories. There has been, generally a preference for the press briefing as the primary means of communicating with the press. We can see at the top of this graph, the George W. Bush administration, in the middle, the Barack Obama administration, and at the bottom, the Trump administration. You notice the difference between the graphs. During the Trump administration, the press briefing on many days was just ignored. There was a deliberate shift away from holding press briefings, which was a strategy trying to manage the press with the Trump administration. Now, during the Biden administration, they have become more regular again, which suggests that perhaps the Trump administration was an outlier in that sense. Instead, reporters adapted during the Trump administration. Rather than relying on formal briefings, what reporters would do is set up their cameras and their microphones on a place called the ellipse. And the ellipse is where visitors would get dropped off. So anytime somebody from a different government agency or maybe the president's campaign was getting dropped off to meet at the White House, the press would have an opportunity to talk to them. And so that became the norm. It was almost like ambushing them on their way into meetings. Another tactic that evolved was the press to camp out near the president's helicopter. And as he was leaving the residence to get into Marine One, they would have these informal gaggles where the press would shout questions and the president would answer them with the helicopter in the background. Having that noise in the background was a convenient way of trying to perhaps ignore questions by saying that you couldn't hear them. Many presidents have adopted that technique. Generally, there is a very adversarial relationship between the press and the president and the president's administration. During the first few months of the Obama administration, President Obama was subject to a lot of negative news stories. A lot of that had to do with just his managing the relationship with Congress. He didn't necessarily do a great job of coordinating with the leadership in the House and the Senate, and that led to a lot of negative stories in the media. And so one thing that the president tried to do was leave Washington. He went on a sort of a town hall tour around the country to try and get away from the Washington press corps and do more local interviews and talk about the successes of his legislative vision. Now, there is, in general, a tendency for the press to cover the president in a negative light. That's just part of their watchdog function. They are somewhat critical. Initially, the coverage of a new president tends to be kind of favorable, but it drops off over time. Here is a comparison from the Washington Post. A couple researchers did what's called a sentiment analysis to try and track the tone of coverage between the Trump administration and the Biden administration over similar periods. And you can see that, despite initial positive coverage that the Biden administration received, there was a definite dip, which sort of trends back to the mean of a general negative tone when talking about the president. Sometimes the presidents might take that adversarial relationship to an entire another level, and President Obama used the Espionage Act of 1917 to arrest reporters for leaking classified information. And so that was an unprecedented use of government power to try and manage the relationship between the press and the administration. President Trump also had an adversarial relationship with the press. Sometimes he would sort of scold them through social media. Other times during interviews, you really got a feel for that relationship. Here he is, this transcript with an interview with Chris Wallace from Fox News, trying to ask the president a question and him just saying, be quiet, I'm trying to talk. And so there was that definite tension anytime the president was talking to a reporter. Again, President Trump also would take to social media to try and accost the press and criticize them of the tone of their coverage. He also used his social media as a means of disintermediation. If we think of what the media does just that. It mediates coverage. It mediates information, giving it to the viewers, the consumers of news. Disintermediation is trying to get around the mediator. And President Trump used his social media presence for that, to try and disintermediate and get around the gatekeeper function of the media. Just to recap, when you're looking at the president and their administration, their relationship with the press, they will often go for spectacle instead of substance. They want good headlines, but they don't necessarily want to be too forthcoming with information. You can also observe pack journalism. Journalists will tend to flock to the same issue or same topic, and they will all focus their coverage on that. A lot of that has to do with cutbacks in newsrooms and a desire for speed, with that continuous news cycle, always looking for new coverage. Presidents will try and disintermediate. They will try and get around the media where possible, and they will also look for friendly media outlets to give them favorable coverage.